Ambassador Kethril of the Varani hegemony had spent 40 years studying primitive species across the galaxy. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for humanity. The Galactic Concordat had observed Earth from a distance for nearly a century before deciding to make formal contact. And during that time, they had witnessed things that made even the most hardened military commanders feel sick to their stomachs. They had seen humans wage wars that lasted for decades, conflicts that consumed entire generations and turned beautiful cities into ash and rubble. And they had watched as humans invented increasingly creative ways to destroy each other with weapons that grew more terrible with each passing year. The Concordat had labeled humanity as a Class 7 threat, which meant they were considered too dangerous for direct contact but too primitive to pose any real risk to galactic civilization. And so the aliens had simply watched and waited and taken notes. When humanity finally developed faster than light travel and began spreading across the stars, the Concordat knew they could no longer remain silent. And so Ambassador Kethril was chosen to make first contact with this violent and unpredictable species. He arrived at the human colony of New Geneva during what his intelligence reports described as a major crisis. A faction calling itself the Martian Sovereignty had declared independence from the United Earth Nations and launched a military campaign to capture strategic resources throughout the solar system. And their latest target was a mining outpost called Velar 7, which sat on top of one of the largest titanium deposits ever discovered. The siege had been going on for 3 days when Kethril's diplomatic vessel entered human space, and he fully expected to find a civilization gripped by fear and desperation. He expected weeping families and grim-faced soldiers preparing for the worst, and he expected the kind of somber atmosphere that always accompanied warfare among the civilized species of the galaxy. What he found instead made him question everything he thought he knew about the universe. The streets of New Geneva were filled with humans, but they were not crying or praying or preparing for death. And instead, they seemed to be celebrating something that Kethril could not understand. Giant holographic screens had been set up in public squares, and thousands of humans had gathered around them to watch live footage from the battlefield. And the noise they made was unlike anything the ambassador had ever heard. They were cheering. They were actually cheering as soldiers fired weapons at each other on a distant moon. And some of them held signs with names and slogans written on them, while others waved flags representing different military units. Kethril watched in stunned silence as a group of young humans argued passionately about something called tactical positioning, and another group placed bets on which side would capture a particular hill before sunset. An older human male stood near the ambassador with a drink in his hand, and he laughed loudly when an explosion appeared on the screen and shouted something about the Martians using the same opening play they tried at Ceres last year. "Bold strategy," the man said to his companions with a grin on his face. "Let us see if it works out better for them this time." Kethril felt his scales changing color in distress, which was an involuntary reaction his species experienced when confronted with something deeply disturbing. These creatures were watching their own kind fight and possibly die, and they were treating it like entertainment. He approached a human woman who seemed to be explaining the situation to a group of children, and he activated his translation device with trembling appendages. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that he hoped sounded calm and diplomatic. "I am Ambassador Kethril of the Varani hegemony, and I have come to offer assistance during this terrible conflict." The woman looked at him with an expression of mild curiosity rather than the desperate gratitude he had expected. "Oh, welcome to New Geneva," she said with a friendly smile. "Are you here to watch the siege? Because you picked a great day for it, since the Martians are finally making their push for the eastern ridge." "Watch the siege," Kethril repeated slowly. certain that his translator must be malfunctioning. Yeah, it has been pretty exciting so far. And my nephew is deployed with the 7th Orbital Rangers, so we are all rooting for them to hold the line. Your nephew is fighting in this battle. Sure is. And he messaged us this morning to say his squad has a really good position overlooking the main approach. So we should be seeing some action from them soon. Kethro stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what he was hearing. Do you not fear for his life? He asked. Are you not terrified that he might be killed? The woman's expression shifted slightly, and she seemed to realize that she was dealing with someone who did not understand something fundamental about the situation. Oh, you are new to human space, are you not? She said with a sympathetic tone. I keep forgetting how strange this must look to outsiders. She gestured toward the screen, where soldiers in heavy armor were moving across rocky terrain while explosions erupted around them. Nobody has died yet, she explained. We evacuated all the civilians from Velar 7 last week before the fighting started. And the soldiers on both sides are using standard engagement protocols. Standard engagement protocols. You know, the rules of the game. Kethro felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Game, he whispered. You call this a game? The woman laughed softly and shook her head. I know it probably seems weird if you are not used to it. But yes, this is basically how we handle warfare now. And it is actually a lot more civilized than it sounds. She pointed at the children she had been speaking with earlier. These kids are learning about military strategy and tactics. And when they grow up, they might choose to serve in the armed forces themselves. But for now, they are just enjoying the competition like everyone else. Kethral looked at the children, who were watching the battle with bright eyes and excited expressions. And he felt something cold settle into his chest. Would you like me to explain the rules? The woman offered. It might help you understand what is happening. The ambassador nodded slowly, unable to find words to express the horror that was growing inside him. He had come here expecting to find savages, and in a way he had found exactly that. But they were not the kind of savages he had anticipated. These humans had turned the act of war into something recreational, and they watched their soldiers fight with the same enthusiasm that the Varani showed for artistic performances or philosophical debates. As the woman began explaining something about point systems and victory conditions, Kethral realized that humanity was far stranger and far more terrifying than anyone in the galaxy had ever imagined. And he had a feeling that this was only the beginning of his education. Commander Elena Vasquez was a tall woman with short gray hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. And she greeted Ambassador Kethral aboard the UEN Persistent negotiation with a handshake that was surprisingly gentle for someone in her position. Welcome aboard. Ambassador, she said, as she led him through corridors filled with busy crew members. I understand you have some questions about how we conduct military operations. That would be an understatement, Kethral replied, still trying to process everything he had witnessed in New Geneva. Your people were treating an active siege like a sporting event, and I must confess that I find this deeply disturbing. Vasquez nodded as though she had heard this reaction many times before. I imagine it looks pretty strange from the outside, she admitted. But I promise there is a logic to it, even if that logic takes some time to understand. She led him to a briefing room where holographic displays showed tactical maps of the Velar 7 region, and she gestured for him to take a seat at a large table covered with datapads and empty coffee cups. First, let me give you some historical context, she began. About 200 years ago, humanity nearly destroyed itself in what we call the Resource Wars. The display shifted to show images that made Kethral's scales ripple with discomfort. Cities reduced to radioactive craters, oceans choked with debris and chemical contamination, Entire continents rendered uninhabitable by weapons that seemed designed to cause maximum suffering. We came very close to extinction, Vasquez continued. And when the survivors finally managed to establish peace, they made a collective decision that changed everything about how we approach conflict. They banned warfare, Catherall guessed, thinking of how other species had responded to similar catastrophes. No, Vasquez said with a slight smile. They tried that first, and it lasted about 15 years before the whole system collapsed. Because it turns out that humans are really bad at not fighting. She pulled up another display showing charts and graphs that the ambassador could not immediately interpret. What they did instead was much more practical. And they accepted that conflict was inevitable, but decided to change the rules of how the conflict would be conducted. The rules of the game, Catherall said, remembering what the woman in New Geneva had told him. Exactly, and I know that phrase sounds flippant, but it actually represents one of the most sophisticated systems of controlled violence ever developed. She began walking him through the details, and the more Catherall learned, the more his understanding of humanity shifted. Wars were now fought according to strict protocols that both sides agreed to before any shots were fired. And these protocols covered everything from acceptable weapons to time limits to conditions for victory. Civilian zones were declared sacrosanct, and any faction that deliberately targeted non-combatants automatically forfeited the conflict and faced severe consequences from the rest of humanity. Soldiers wore sophisticated transponders that tracked their status in real time. And when a soldier took damage that would be considered a serious wound, they were flagged as eliminated and had to withdraw from the battlefield. Actual deaths still happen, Vasquez admitted with a more somber expression. Equipment malfunctions, accidents, soldiers who push themselves too hard and ignore their warning systems. And we mourn every single one of those losses. But the goal is not to kill, Catherall said slowly. Beginning to understand, the goal is to win, Vasquez corrected him. Killing is just one way to achieve victory, and it turns out that it is usually not the most efficient way. She showed him statistics that demonstrated how the casualty rates in human conflicts had dropped by over 90% since the new system was implemented, and how the average war now lasted weeks instead of years. We still compete fiercely, she explained. We still fight for territory and resources and political power, but we do it in a way that does not threaten our survival as a species. Catherall considered this for a long moment. And what happens if someone refuses to follow these rules? He asked. What if a faction decides that they want to fight the old way? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Vasquez's expression became something that the ambassador had never seen on a human face before. She pulled up another set of images, and these were far worse than the ones showing the aftermath of the resource wars. The absolutist uprising, she said quietly, happened about 70 years ago when a faction decided that the new rules were a sign of weakness and that true strength meant fighting without restrictions. The images showed the complete and utter destruction of what had once been a thriving colony world. And the data indicated that the conflict had lasted less than 2 weeks. They targeted civilian populations deliberately. Vasquez continued, they killed children and elderly and anyone else they could reach, believing that this would terrify everyone else into submission. What happened to them? Catherall asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer, when they broke the rules, we stopped playing games with them. Vasquez turned off the displays and looked directly at the ambassador with eyes that held no warmth at all. The response was unified across all of human space, and every faction that had been fighting each other the day before put aside their differences and turned their attention to the absolutists. And there are no absolutists anymore. Vasquez said simply, there are no survivors, no prisoners, no descendants. and no one who carries their genetic markers or their cultural identity. She paused to let that sink in. We erase them so completely that in another 100 years, historians will debate whether they ever existed at all. Kethril felt a chill running through his entire body. You committed genocide. We removed a threat to the system that keeps humanity alive, Vasquez corrected him. And we did it so thoroughly that no one else has been tempted to break the rules since then. She stood up and walked to the window. Looking out at the stars, we keep the games fun and fair and competitive. Ambassador, because as long as everyone is having fun, nobody thinks about what happens when the games stop. She turned back to face him. We are not a peaceful species, and we never will be. But we have learned to channel our violence in ways that do not destroy us. And anyone who threatens that system learns very quickly why the rest of the galaxy should be grateful that we play games instead of fighting wars. Kethril sat in silence for a long time after that. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I think I need to revise my report to the Concordat, he said. Vasquez smiled. But there was no humor in it. I think that would be wise. Over the following weeks, Ambassador Kethril embedded himself with the United Earth Nations forces at Velar 7. And what he witnessed during that time would haunt him for the rest of his long life. The human soldiers treated their deployment like athletes preparing for a championship competition. And their base camp had the atmosphere of a training facility rather than a military installation. Every morning they gathered in briefing rooms to study holographic recordings of their opponents, analyzing movement patterns and tactical decisions with the intensity of scholars. Examining ancient texts, the Martians have been using a defensive formation for the past 3 engagements. A young sergeant explained to her squad. They anchor their heavy units on high ground and force us to attack uphill, which gives them a significant advantage in the point calculations. So we flank them. Another soldier suggested. That is what they expect us to do, the sergeant replied. They have been leaving their eastern flank looking weak on purpose, trying to bait us into a trap. What if we just ignore the bait and push straight up the middle? The discussion continued for another hour, and Kethril watched in fascination as these warriors debated strategy with the enthusiasm of children arguing about their favorite games. They had developed an entire vocabulary for this, a lexicon of slang that made warfare sound like a recreational activity. When a soldier was hit by a weapon and their transponder flagged them as eliminated, they called it getting tagged, and the soldier would have to return to a medical station for evaluation if their injuries were minor. They could return to the field after a mandatory rest period that the humans called respawning. Soldiers who accumulated enough successful engagements earned what they called kill streaks, which granted them access to better equipment and more prestigious assignments. Low-risk engagements designed to accumulate points without serious danger were referred to as farming, and some units specialized in this approach, while others preferred more aggressive tactics. At the end of every battle, regardless of which side had won, the soldiers would communicate with their opponents and exchange a phrase that Kethril found deeply unsettling. GG, they would say, which apparently stood for a good game. It was a ritual acknowledgement that both sides had competed fairly, and it was considered extremely poor form to refuse this exchange or to show genuine hostility toward a defeated enemy. The ambassador spent one afternoon observing a group of UN soldiers who had captured a Martian position, and he watched in disbelief as they helped their eliminated opponents gather their equipment and prepare for transport back to their own lines. Nice. Try with that flanking maneuver, a UN corporal said to a Martian sergeant. You almost had us. Your sniper spotted us too early, the Martian replied with a rueful smile. I should have waited for better cover. Want to grab a drink later at the neutral zone? Because I want to hear more about that new rifle your people are using. Sure. I will meet you there after I finish my paperwork. Kethril approached the corporal after the Martians had departed. You are friendly with your enemies, he said. Unable to hide his confusion. Well, enemy is kind of a strong word, the corporal replied. We are on opposite sides right now, but the war will be over eventually. And then we will probably be working together again. You do not hate them. The corporal looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Why would I hate them? Because they are just doing their job the same as me. And besides, some of my best friends are serving with the Martian forces. Your best friends? Yeah. I went through basic training with a guy who later transferred to the Sovereignty. And we still play games together online when we are off duty. Kethril felt his translator struggling to keep up with the cultural concepts being expressed. You maintain social relationships with people you might kill in battle. Well, I would not actually kill him, the corporal said. I might tag him out if we ended up facing each other. But that is different. Is it? The human considered the question for a moment. I guess from your perspective it might seem weird, but think about it like this. Because when you play a competitive game with a friend, you want to beat them. Right, I suppose. But you do not want them to stop existing. And you do not want to hurt them permanently. And you definitely do not want to never see them again. The corporal shrugged. That is how we think about war now. And I want to win, and I want my side to achieve our objectives. But I do not want the Martians to suffer or die. And I definitely do not want to destroy their civilization. What about the people who do want those things? The corporal's expression changed slightly. And for just a moment, Kethril saw something cold behind his friendly eyes. Those people do not last long in our military, he said quietly. We screen for that kind of thinking. And anyone who shows signs of genuine bloodlust gets removed from combat roles pretty quickly, because they are dangerous. Because they are a threat to the system, the corporal corrected. If people start fighting to kill instead of fighting to win, everything falls apart. He gestured toward the battlefield, where another engagement was beginning. This works because everyone agrees to play by the rules. And the moment someone starts breaking those rules, the game stops being fun for everyone. And what happens then? The corporal did not answer immediately. And when he did, his voice was much quieter. Then it stops being a game. That evening, Kethril observed something that disturbed him even more than the fighting itself. In the neutral zone between the two forces, soldiers from both sides gathered at a temporary establishment that served food and drinks. And they mingled freely as though they were not engaged in an armed conflict. A Martian sergeant and a UN corporal sat together at a small table. And from their body language, it was clear that they were romantically involved. They are in a relationship, Kethril said to a human officer who was standing nearby. Yeah. Those two have been together for about a year now, the officer replied casually. It is actually pretty common for people on opposite sides to date each other. But they are at war. They are competing in a conflict. The officer corrected gently. That is not the same thing as being at war. At least not the way you probably think of it. Kethril watched the couple share a meal and laugh about something that he could not hear. And he wondered how any species could separate violence from hatred so completely. These humans had turned the act of organized killing into something almost recreational. And they had done it so thoroughly that love could bloom on the same battlefields where they fought to defeat each other. It was beautiful in a way. He supposed it was also absolutely terrifying. 6 months after Ambassador Kethril made first contact with humanity, the Varani hegemony made the worst decision in the history of their civilization. The High Council had reviewed all of his reports, and they had studied the footage of human warfare with great interest. And they had come to a conclusion that seemed logical based on everything they observed. Humanity was weak. The Varani were a proud warrior species who had conquered 17 star systems through brutal and unrelenting violence. And they had never encountered an enemy they could not break through sheer force of will. When they looked at humanity, they saw a species that had forgotten how to fight. They saw soldiers who treated combat like entertainment and who showed mercy to defeated enemies instead of destroying them completely. They saw civilians who watched battles on screens and cheered as though they were attending sporting events, rather than witnessing the defense of their territory. Most importantly, they saw a species that had rules, and in the experience of the Varani, rules were nothing more than weaknesses waiting to be exploited. The attack came without warning on a peaceful morning at the human colony of New Taipei. A Varani battle fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above the planet and immediately began orbital bombardment of population centers. There was no declaration of war, no attempt at negotiation, and no opportunity for the humans to evacuate their civilians or prepare their defenses. 40,000 humans died in the first hour of the assault. Ambassador Kethro learned about the attack while he was still embedded with the UN forces at Valor 7, and he watched in horror as the news spread through the human ranks. The reaction was not what he expected. There was no panic, no screaming, and no visible signs of the terror that should have accompanied such devastating news. Instead, something much more unsettling happened. The humans went quiet. Every soldier, every officer, every support staff member simply stopped what they were doing and stood in complete silence as the reports continued to come in. Kethro watched a young private receive word that her entire family had been killed in the initial bombardment. And she did not cry or scream or collapse in grief. She simply looked at the message for a long moment, then put away her communication device and walked to the armory. "Where are you going?" a fellow soldier asked. "To get my real equipment," she replied, and her voice was completely flat. Within hours, something extraordinary happened across all of human space. The Martian sovereignty declared an immediate ceasefire with the United Earth Nations, and the commanders of both sides met to coordinate a joint response to the Varani aggression. Factions that had been competing against each other for decades put aside their differences and began sharing intelligence and resources. Colony worlds that had been neutral in human conflicts suddenly began mobilizing their populations for war, real war, not the games they had been playing with each other. Kethral managed to send an urgent message to the Varani High Council, begging them to reconsider their attack and offering to negotiate a peaceful resolution. The response he received made his blood run cold. "The humans are soft, and their society is decadent." The council replied, "They have forgotten the true nature of war, and they will break beneath the might of the hegemony." "You do not understand," Kethral tried to explain. "The games are not a sign of weakness. They are a containment system." Containment for what? Before he could answer, he was summoned to a briefing with the Joint Human Command, and what he saw there would stay with him for the rest of his life. The room was filled with officers from every human faction, and they were planning something that bore no resemblance to the conflicts Kethral had observed over the previous months. There were no discussions of point systems or victory conditions. There was no talk of avoiding civilian casualties or respecting surrender. There were only targets, timetables, and projected body counts. Commander Vasquez stood at the front of the room, and her face held an expression that Kethral had never seen on any human before. It was focus, pure, absolute, terrifying focus. "The Varani rejected our request for rules of engagement," she announced to the assembled officers. "They have declared that they intend to fight without restrictions and that they will target civilian populations until we surrender unconditionally." A murmur ran through the room. But it was not a sound of fear or uncertainty. It was something darker. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time and was now waking up. Therefore, Vasquez continued, by unanimous agreement of all human factions, we are officially suspending the conventional warfare protocols for the duration of this conflict. She paused and looked around the room. We are not playing games anymore. The assembled humans nodded in grim agreement. And Catherall felt a chill run through his entire body. He had spent months watching humans compete against each other with rules and sportsmanship and friendly rivalry. And he had almost forgotten what Commander Vasquez had told him during their first meeting. We are not a peaceful species, she had said, but we have learned to channel our violence in ways that do not destroy us. Now he understood what she meant. The games had never been about limiting human capability. They had been about controlling it over the following 11 days. Catherall watched as humanity demonstrated exactly what they were capable of when they stopped holding back. The Varani fleet was systematically hunted down and destroyed, with no prisoners taken and no mercy shown. Varani military installations across 17 star systems were reduced to rubble in coordinated strikes that showed a level of tactical sophistication the hegemony had never encountered. The Varani homeworld was blockaded and bombarded until their government collapsed, and their population was reduced to begging for the mercy that they had refused to show humanity. On the 12th day, the surviving Varani leaders formally surrendered, and they agreed to every demand the humans made without negotiation or resistance. But the truly terrifying thing was not the destruction that humanity had inflicted. It was how easily they had done it, and how quickly they returned to their games once it was over. The great hall of the Galactic Concordat was silent as Ambassador Catherall took his position at the speaking platform. Representatives from over 200 species had gathered to hear his report on humanity, and the tension in the room was thick enough to taste. Everyone had heard about what happened to the Varani hegemony. Everyone wanted to understand how a species that treated warfare like entertainment could transform so quickly into something that had brought one of the galaxy's most aggressive civilizations to its knees in less than 2 weeks. Honored delegates, Catherall began, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to share. I have spent nearly a year living among humans, observing their society, their military, and their approach to conflict, and I am here to tell you that everything we believed about them was wrong. He paused to let that statement settle over the assembly. We looked at humanity and saw violence. And we were not wrong about that, because humans are perhaps the most naturally violent species in the known galaxy. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall, particularly from the Concordat's military advisors. But we made a critical error in our analysis, Catherall continued. We assumed that their tendency toward violence made them primitive and uncontrolled, when in fact the opposite is true. He activated a holographic display showing footage from the siege of Velar 7. Scenes of humans cheering and betting and treating battle like a sporting event. When I first witnessed this, I was horrified. And I believed that humanity had become so desensitized to death that they no longer valued life at all. The footage shifted to show the aftermath of the Varani attack on New Taipei, and then to the systematic destruction of the Varani military. Now I understand that I had it completely backwards. Catherall looked out at the assembled delegates, making sure he had their full attention. Humans are not violent despite their games, and they are not callous despite their competitive approach to warfare. But instead, they are restrained because of those things. He let that sink in for a moment. The games, the rules, the points and rankings and friendly rivalries, all of it exists for one purpose, and that purpose is to contain something that humanity fears more than death itself. And what is that? A delegate from the Thrall Collective asked themselves. Cathrall replied simply. He pulled up more footage. This time, historical records from the resource wars that had nearly destroyed humanity 2 centuries ago. This species has spent its entire existence learning how to kill, and they are extraordinarily good at it. But somewhere along the way they realized that if they did not find a way to control that impulse, they would destroy themselves completely. So they created rules. The Thrall delegate said. They created more than rules, Cathrall corrected. They created an entire system designed to redirect their violent tendencies into something sustainable. He showed statistics about casualty rates and conflict duration before and after the implementation of the gaming protocols. By turning war into a competition, they gave themselves an outlet for their aggression that did not require actual destruction. And by establishing strict rules about civilian protections and acceptable conduct, they ensured that even their worst conflicts would not threaten their survival as a species. But the Varani proved that they are still capable of unrestricted warfare. Another delegate pointed out. Yes, Cathrall agreed. And that is precisely what makes them so dangerous. He deactivated the historical footage and addressed the assembly directly. The humans I met were kind and friendly and surprisingly good company. And they welcomed me into their society and shared their culture and treated me as an honored guest. That does not sound particularly threatening, a delegate from the Mavari Union commented. It is not, Cathrall said. As long as you play by their rules. He gestured toward the empty seats that had once been occupied by the Varani delegation. But the moment you violate those rules, the moment you attack their civilians or refuse to engage in good faith, something changes. And the friendly competitors become something else entirely. What do they become? Cathrall considered his words carefully. They become what they would have been if they had never learned to play games. He said, they become a species that has spent thousands of years perfecting the art of destroying its enemies, with no mercy, no hesitation, and no capacity for forgiveness. The hall was completely silent now. The Varani made the mistake of believing that humanity's restraint was weakness, and they assumed that a species which treated war like entertainment had forgotten how to fight for real. He shook his head slowly. They had not forgotten, and they had simply chosen not to, and when that choice was taken away from them, they remembered everything. A delegate from the Crescent Federation raised an appendage to speak. What do you recommend? Ambassador. Because how should the Concordat approach relations with this species? Cathrall managed something like a smile. Though it held no warmth, learn to play their games, he said. Embrace their rules, participate in their competitions, and let them keep score and celebrate victories and shake hands after battles. That seems almost too simple. It is not simple at all, Cathrall replied. It requires accepting that you will sometimes lose, that you will sometimes feel frustrated, and that you will sometimes question whether the whole system is worth maintaining. He paused, but the alternative is far worse. What alternative? Cathrall looked out at the assembly with eyes that had seen too much. If you refuse to play their games, if you break their rules, if you attack their civilians or fight without honor, then they will stop treating war as a competition. He let the silence stretch for a long moment, and when they stop keeping score, they start counting something else. What do they count? Bodies, Cathrall said quietly. They count bodies until they feel that the scales are balanced. And they count and count and count until there is nothing left of their enemy to count. He gathered his notes and prepared to leave the platform. I have seen what happens when humans stop playing games. And I watched them dismantle one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy with a precision and efficiency that still gives enemy nightmares. Surely they can be reasoned with, someone called out. They can. Cathrall agreed. As long as you accept their rules, and as long as you treat their civilians as sacred, and as long as you remember that the friendly competition is a gift they are offering you, not a weakness you can exploit. He began walking toward the exit. Play their games, follow their rules, and they will be the best friends the galaxy has ever known. He paused at the doorway and looked back at the assembly one final time, but never, ever forget that underneath all the sportsmanship and the cheering crowds and the friendly rivalries, there is something ancient and terrible waiting for the next fool who thinks they can win by breaking the rules. With that, Ambassador Kethril left the Great Hall, and behind him 200 species sat in silence, contemplating a future where humanity was either their greatest ally or their final enemy, and hoping desperately that they would never have to find out which one it would be. In the months that followed, the Galactic Concordat formally requested membership in the human gaming leagues, and humanity welcomed them with open arms and cheerful enthusiasm. The games continued, the rules held, and the galaxy slowly learned to play along. And somewhere in the back of everyone's mind, in the quiet hours when fear crept in unbidden, they all remembered the same truth. The humans were not playing games because they had forgotten how to fight. They were playing games so they would never have to remember.